Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, from the Iraq War to internet addiction, from child abuse to credit card fraud. If it's a major political or social issue, Frontline on PBS covers it. One of the program's founders and busiest producers is from Idaho, and Michael Kirk joins me next to talk about America's top of the ticket stories. That's Dialogue. Stay tuned.
In 2008, this historic race, it is more important than ever to know how they think, what makes them tick, and what they really believe.
Democracy is coming to the USA.
Before the vote, the choice, 2008.
And hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A welcome as well to those of you listening on public radio and the World Wide Web. It's election season, and as you just heard, that means it's almost time for one of Frontline's signature documentaries, The Choice. For 20 years, Frontline's been profiling the major candidates for the American presidency, giving voters a behind-the-scenes look at their backgrounds, values, and life decisions. The producer of The Choice this year is Michael Kirk. Kirk, an Idaho native, is one of the founders of Frontline. He got his reporting start right here in Boise at KBOI Radio and TV, and then at Idaho Public Television in Moscow. The producer of more than 200 national documentaries, Kirk has spent much of his time the past 7 years documenting the political intrigue behind the decision to go to war in Iraq and the consequences of that decision. He's produced 10 of Frontline's 40 programs on the Bush administration's war on terror, including The Torture Question, Endgame, Cheney's Law, and the two-part Frontline entitled Bush's War. And Michael Kirk joins me to talk about his work. Welcome back to Boise.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And one note, because this is a taped program, there will be no call-ins. Well, let's start right off with The Choice, since as we talk, you're in the thick of filming that. In fact, you joked last night when your phone rang during a presentation that perhaps it was John McCain calling.
In jest. I wish it was John McCain calling.
You know, some have called this the most important American election in decades. What's your take on that? What's your emotional energy going into this project?
I'm very interested in the impulse and the yearning in American society for change that I think has yielded up these two very different, extremely different candidates, different in lots of ways, and it is those differences that we are exploring in our film.
Well, it's interesting because Americans seem to often complain that, oh, I don't have a choice, all politicians are alike, but in this election, as you referred, there really are some quite clear distinctions aside from party affiliation: old and young, white and black, veteran and non-veteran, voting for the war and against it. Do you have a sense of the themes yet, how you're going to put this together or carve it up?
It's a really good question, and it's the thing that kind of haunts me all the time. I worry a lot about it. How do we go after these fellows? Because essentially what our film are two biographies. And within those two biographies, and the biographies are woven, and within those two woven biographies are the personal stories, the personal biographies and the political biographies. So you really have kind of four things working and bouncing off of each other, all of which define the characters. So having to sit down and say, what is the sort of overarching way you would describe John McCain's Odyssean struggle, for lack of a more precise and maybe simpler definition, and by the same token, what is Barack Obama struggling with in the kind of overall way that he looks at, that he has lived his life and that he looks at running for the presidency. And deciding on those two things has been the hardest part, but finally, because we had to, we have decided what those two elements of their character are.
Which is?
John McCain, who has lived a life as the son of two famous admirals, a rebellious son of two famous admirals, not wanting to be one himself, has lived his life as a maverick, as an outsider, as a, for lack of a better word, insurgent, if you will, in life, not wanting to play by the rules, always loving the idea that he was Mr. Outside. In order to win the presidency of the United States of America in a party where he has been the outsider against a very powerful and vindictive administration, the Bush administration, John McCain at some moment had to make a decision to walk inside just enough to come close to George Bush and his administration, just enough that he could have the Republican Party's nomination and their support in an election. So John McCain is always walking this line between Mr. Outside and Mr. Inside. He has been doing that all of his life, so that as we look back at moments where he was at Annapolis, where he finished 5th from the bottom in his class, as a POW where he struggled mightily with the North Vietnamese, as the Navy liaison, and all throughout the rest of his political career, he has had that struggle, Mr. Outside versus Mr. Inside. Just how much do I compromise my own personal feelings? And to watch that closely is maybe an indication about how John McCain will be as president.
And Obama?
Obama has had as a black young boy growing up in a white family, a mother from Kansas.
He's kind of an outsider too.
He's been an outsider in that sense, and he's had a kind of racial identity quest he's been on growing up under those circumstances in Hawaii, in Indonesia, trying all of his life to kind of transcend his race and bring an understanding of that to political circumstances, to personal circumstances, come to grips with it, face it, and once he made the decision to run for the presidency, run not as a black politician, not as Jesse Jackson, not as Charlie Rangel, not as somebody else, not as Al Sharpton, not as a black politician, but as a politician who happens to be black. A huge and important distinction for politicians, black politicians, African-American politicians, his age, his group. Not people out of the civil rights struggle, but people who are the inheritors of that struggle, who say, I'm not just black, I'm also a lot of other things. But running as the first black candidate for the presidency, forced to confront it by who else but Bill and Hillary Clinton.
We should mention that this program profiles these individuals, but you don't talk to them. You don't interview them.
Yes, it's been a tradition of the choice not to interview the actual candidates. We interview and hope to interview. We haven't yet as we talk, but we will have, I suspect, I hope, by the time the broadcast airs. We do interview the wives. We interview family members who are as close as can be, friends who've known them many years, political associates who've known them a long time, and especially for the purposes of this film, the people who were with them during the last and very intense primary campaign. But we do not interview the candidates as much as I'd like to know them personally and hope I will get to see them and know them and be around them, because for obvious reasons, you would expect them to constantly come back and spin it the way they would spin their story. Not that they would lie, but that they have a kind of take on their story that is no doubt at variance with what we'll come up with.
A lot of your programs, you know, when you profile major figures, they decline to talk to you. I'm going to imagine that this might be one instance where the candidates, oh, please, can't I talk to you?
I think they'd love to accept it. I try never to talk to anybody who won't give me at least an hour and a half of conversation, maybe more sometimes, especially if they're very important. So I try to insist that I get enough time to actually get through the spin and the defensiveness and the familiar stories and the putting it on autopilot. I mean, these candidates by now, after the rigorous primaries they've been through and now the general election, these candidates are on autopilot when they answer an awful lot of questions, especially probing questions about their life. They would look at me and say, why are we talking about high school? I'm running for the presidency of the United States. So it's just as well that they may want to talk to me, but only in the most contained and spare ways, and that's not good for what we're trying to do.
You mentioned the primaries. This was a tight primary season, going longer than normal. So I imagine as a filmmaker, you had to hedge your bets and film both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama.
It was pretty clear if you read the numbers that Hillary Clinton had no chance after probably South Carolina, maybe even after New Hampshire, even though she won in New Hampshire. But we had to stay with it in that sense, and staying with it in some cases meant biting your fingernails and waiting and sitting on the side and keeping, your powder dry, because we don't have unlimited amounts of money. We couldn't shoot all the time, and the Obama campaign, to their credit, had said, we're not going to talk about any of this until we've actually been declared winners and Hillary Clinton has conceded to us. So they wouldn't talk to us in any way. So we did a lot of McCain, and we watched the Clinton and Obama race. We then began to cover those two races, and the film has lots of elements of the way that Hillary Clinton's strategy worked, because what it really reveals is how Barack Obama and his organization are when push comes to shove.
Do you ever include third parties or get grief from third parties if you don't include them?
No, there's a FCC ruling and a PBS ruling that allows us, as a regularly scheduled broadcast, to cover only the major party candidates. If somebody were really viable, when Ross Perot was at 12 and 14% many years ago, I was assigned the task of making the Ross Perot story, which was, I must say, a treat, and in some ways, not because of my political orientation, but as a filmmaker, it broke my heart that Perot pulled out, because it was going to be a really good film.
This program's a bit different than some of your others. You often take a look back at a historical event, be it Waco or even a murder mystery in the sense of Kip Kinkle, our decision to go to war, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is real time going forward, so it's a little bit different than looking backwards. And how do you choose, my goodness, what to
exactly
to
well
film?
Some of it is real time, but some of it is even if it's near history, looking back at Iowa, looking back at New Hampshire, what happened in South Carolina, what was up with the Reverend Wright controversy, what did John McCain, when John McCain's campaign died last summer and he was what they call the dead man walking and all alone in New Hampshire moving around, that's history. It's also now, and it has precedence in actions that he took as a POW in other places, where he found himself tremendously comfortable when he is in that rock and a hard place kind of place. And that's I mean, yes, it's current, but it's also past.
There's a lot of profile programs on candidates. What makes this one different? Is it in part what you just said, that you can stay with them for a long time, that you can go back and recapitulate things and provide context?
Yes, I hope so. I think part of our work and part of what PBS offers that I don't think cable news offers, and I don't think, even though cable news and even A&E have made biographies of the two candidates, is something deeper. We because we cover politics and have for 26 years now, because we're so interested in and know about all of those, we've had the time to all of those issues. We've had time to think about those issues. We started covering John McCain back at the Keating 5 days, back when he was a congressman from Arizona. Barack Obama, we were on to almost right away at that convention in 2004. So we've had the time to follow them. We've also had the time to think about it in a way that's slightly different. We have the time in the editing room. We have the time to shoot more, and all of those things contribute, I hope, to a more in-depth and a deeper understanding of who they are and where they fall.
You mentioned time and time to look back, but then there's also the pressures of putting this together. What's your turnaround time on this particular program?
Well, we started researching a year ago and reading the books and getting to know, because we also have another ambition inside this, which is to explain where the American electorate is at this exact moment against these characters. So that what is that change impulse, in other words. So we started to look into that a long time before we knew that it was Barack Obama and John McCain.
But you'll have to edit it pretty quickly, won't you?
But we will, yes, we will finish shooting sometime around Labor Day. I'll start editing and writing in August sometime, but we'll cut it in maybe 8 weeks, 7 weeks. That's still, by today's television standards, a leisurely pace, because unfortunately the economics of most broadcast journalism have shortened the window. So for me to be able to take 7 or 8 weeks to do a 2-hour film is fast by PBS standards and British television standards and others, but slow by the way that television has become a fast food commodity.
And finally, what do you want voters to take away from watching The Choice? Do you want them to know at the end of it, hey, I think I'm going to vote for this guy over that guy?
There are many voters out there, I think, Marcia. I think there are people who've already made up their mind, and what this film will do is confirm their choice or make them question some parts of it. There will be, if some of the experts as we speak now are right, it could be an extremely close election, failing a gaffe or a mistake or some horrible thing we discover about one of the candidates. So it is possible that it will be close, in which case this film could be extremely useful to people before they go into the ballot box. And there are others who will see things in here about the other candidate that they need in order to confirm their choice one way or the other. So I always think of it as lots of different audiences for a film like this. It's also going to be seen all over the world. It's been purchased by, at this moment, 40-some countries, all of whom are desperate to understand what is happening in our democracy. Many people in the Arab world will watch this film, and in the Middle East will see this film, and I think and I hope see that our democracy, independent of whatever they think of the Bush administration and the Iraq War and what we've done in Afghanistan and other places in response to 9/11, that we are a country that debates, has lively debates and has very different kinds of people who run for the highest office in our land. And I think of that as an interesting side benefit of making the film as well.
Whoever wins will have to deal with the legacy of the Bush administration. A large part of that, of course, is the so-called war on terror.
Yes.
The frontline producers made a decision shortly after 9/11, within days, that this was going to be a turning point for the program, and that you were going to be on this story from the very beginning.
Yes, for a handful of us, certainly speaking for myself, and I think a couple of other producers, you had the feeling as that day wore on, 9/11 wore on, that this was why we had been working all of our careers, that these were career-defining events that we would now, everything I knew about how to make a film, what I knew about Washington, I'd spent a tremendous amount of time behind the scenes in other administrations, so I sort of knew how the federal government worked and how the White House works. All of us decided that from our own perspectives, we were going to dedicate our careers largely to this. None of us had any idea. I certainly didn't have any idea that I was making a mini-series of 10 films. I thought I was making one at a time, and I was just kind of following them along.
10 out of, I think, almost 40?
Out of 40, yes.
Do you get tired of revisiting the same issue over and over again?
Every time I finish a film, I say, well, that's the last one we'll do about Iraq, and my whole staff reaches into their pockets and pulls out $1 and sets it on the table and says, you want a badge? It always, what happens is a film will end like the torture question ended. And we got received a phone call from a senator's office that said, wonderful film, unbelievable, thank you very much. By the way, as good as it was, there was one character missing, and we'd be more than happy to help you with some information we have on that character. And we said, who was it? And they said, Dick Cheney's role in the torture question. And we said, well, that's interesting. And suddenly, between the Central Intelligence Agency and this United States Senator's office and some people in the Defense Department, information started to come our way that led us to make the rather big film about Dick Cheney called The Dark Side. Following that, we then, of course, made Cheney's Law based on information that came as a result of that film. So each time we made something, more information started to come our way. And
many of those works are compiled in Bush's War, which was a 4.5-hour documentary. You know, some thought there'd be Iraq fatigue, that people wouldn't watch this, but not true. People watched it, and even more, they watched it on the web in huge numbers.
Yes, millions of people have watched it on the World Wide Web. You can see all of these films at the Frontline website. That website we created intentionally to pull together the 40 films, the information from that, the hundreds and hundreds of interviews that I and other producers have done, the visuals, the stock footage, the documents, so that people, scholars, students, other journalists, and just viewers could go to the web, watch the film, pull down bits and pieces, fragments of the information, so that you could understand what actually happened with the yellow cake issue, what actually happened with the aluminum tubes. Why did Colin Powell go forward to the United Nations and give that speech? And when he did, what pieces of the information that he gave should he have known or could he have known were not true?
The web has just expanded the possibilities, hasn't it? I mean, it's also made it quite transparent. You can put your interviews up there. You have, in some films, I know, at least in the torture question, a whole producer's track where people can listen to the film and hear your commentary running at the same time. It's just opened up all these educational possibilities.
It's a spectacular new place. I think of Bush's War as the first step as we cross that blood-brain barrier, if you will, between just a television program and the World Wide Web. For a long time, we thought of our films as executive summaries that you could then go to the web and find out more, and a place for our journalism to be transparent. Now we're doing actual original journalism on the web that complements the film. Things we can't get in, or sequences we say to ourselves, well, this will never make the film, but let's shoot it anyway and put it on the web so that people can access this important piece of information. That will be even enhanced on the choice, I think, and Frontline has always been the sort of leader in that deep content public affairs websites, but public television is also in that business now in a very big way, and local television stations like Idaho Public Television are there as well.
All of your films have characters in them. Whether the characters are present or not, in other words, whether they gave you an interview or not,
Right.
there's characters. You've called Bush the incurious
Right.
president as his character. I heard David Gergen refer to him as that recently as well. And then there's Cheney, and these cast of characters, just like in Shakespeare or other myths, and then sub-characters. It's very important for you to have those characters, isn't it? Whether they talk to you or not.
When you tell a story, when anybody in your home tells a story to you, the story is always more interesting if they're not talking about ideas per se and just throwing concepts out, but if they're telling you a story. Once upon a time there was a man or a woman in Idaho that did this and lived by a river, and the river was polluted and her children or his children died, and he wrote a letter to the EPA, and when he wrote the letter wasn't answered, and it made him angry, and he went to Washington. I mean, if I've just told you a story that is an environmental film, for sure, but I didn't start and say, you know, there's a lot of pollution in Idaho rivers and they need to be dealt with by the government because particulates and this and that are in the water. You're not as interested as if I've just told you that story of a person. The same is true with what happened with the war in Iraq and every other film I go for. I always say, who's the main character? Even if I, as you suggest, and rightly so, even if I don't have that person. In one case, I did a film called The Man Who Knew about an FBI agent who was dead.
Yeah.
But there he was, very much alive. It was the biography of that person, in the same way I'm doing the biography of Obama and McCain. So you need a character. The character drives the narrative, drives the story, and the sub-characters around them bounce off of that, and that has never been truer than in the fascinating characters inside the Bush administration.
We're rapidly running out of time, but I want to make sure to talk about a couple of things. Cheney's Law, that film you said was one of the hardest you've ever had to put together. Partly, I'm sure, because he wasn't available, the secrecy issues, but also because it's a complicated task to try and unravel exactly what he was doing.
It's the perfect example of what we were just talking about. If I said to you, there has been an impulse inside the United States government by a certain group of conservative men primarily, going back 30 years, to enhance the powers of the presidency. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the Constitution, and always there have been adherents that say there's not really a tripartite government, there's not really checks and balances. The founders believed that the presidency, the president should be preeminent, not only in times of war, but in every decision. And if the people didn't like it, they should throw him out. And that all Congress is there for is other things, to rubber stamp, to do other kinds of things, print money, sign treaties, but not really to run the country. And the courts are there for the long term in some way. If I told you that story that way, in even more arcane ways, you would be yawning, your viewers would be switching the channel. If I said to you, the Vice President of the United States, there's been a method to his madness all the way through the Iraq War, the War on Terror, ever since he was a congressman. Before that, in fact, when he was a young staffer inside Richard Nixon's presidency, to plant powers inside a president so that the president can do pretty much whatever he wants to run America. And if we don't like it, we can throw him out if we know that he's doing it, including domestic spying, including lots of other things, including torture, changing the Geneva Conventions, whatever it is that a president decides he wants to do. That is something Dick Cheney has been interested in 30 years. And if I showed you how he did it and who he had on his staff to help him do it, so you got to know the characters and the struggles and how they won and what the impact of that is, that's a much better way to tell that story. And in the end, that's what we ended up doing.
And so important for you to have these insiders, not necessarily policy wonks or even Democrats opposing Republicans, but insider Republicans telling the story.
There are no Democrats in these films. There are no experts, outside experts in that way.
Lindsey Graham, John McCain in the torture film saying, hey, this is, we don't agree with our own administration.
Right.
Some of these people at great risk come forward.
They do.
Former interrogators and such to say, do you consider them to be heroes? Do they make you more optimistic about our country?
There are some people inside the Bush administration who argued inside the councils of power that the Bush administration, and they were true believers in the Bush administration, they said, what we're doing is right, but we have to bring the American people along. We need to argue about this. There were others like Karl Rove and others who said, no, we're going to keep it very circumscribed. We're going to keep it out of the hands of the press, keep the debate out of the minds of the people, and we're just going to have this, we're just going to go forward. The people who believed inside that this administration would have been stronger and America would have been stronger if they'd had a free and open debate with each other and in front of the American people, if they would have heard from people who opposed the war or opposed the methods of torture or opposed the weapons of mass destruction or said, wait a minute, what are we going to do after we knock down Saddam Hussein? If that debate would have happened in public, they say, you know, things would have been better. And those are the people inside the administration who always came forward to us and talked, and I appreciate it. I don't know if they're heroic. They're just doing it the way they think they should have been doing it. They didn't do it in the beginning of the administration. They did by the end, and I'm glad they did.
Did making all these films depress you, anger you? What's your general sense about our state of government right now after?
My job is to bring this information forward to your viewers and others and let them decide what they want to do about it. I try to keep my personal feelings and certainly my personal angst about it out of it. I think it's a real privilege that I get to do it and get to bring it forward. And as long as privilege and a responsibility. As long as I can continue to do that, I'm happy no matter what the administration is.
You yourself have said that even now you're still overly ambitious. What's next? I know you've mentioned to some folks that you're interested in Afghanistan and pursuing that story more. Is that next on the docket?
I think whoever the president is, Afghanistan and the pullout from Iraq will be job one. The depletion of our military and the trouble there is phenomenal and fundamental. What we do about Iran is in our future too in this country. The Middle East continues to be of interest to me, and it continues because I'm interested in the military and I'm interested in the new presidency and what the new President McCain or Obama will have to do about that, so I'd like to be there. I'm very interested in intelligence issues. I think the fundamental change inside the Central Intelligence Agency that happened in the Bush administration has long-lasting effects. Of course, we'll continue to watch what happened with Cheney's law and how the new president uses or doesn't use those powers. That is the long-lasting legacy of the Bush administration. It'll be with us for decades, maybe generations, finding out how that has been used, planted, set aside, what is actually secretly hidden that is now the law that we don't know about yet, are things that I think investigative journalism will be looking at for another decade or two, and I fully intend to be a part of that process.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your intelligence with us. You've been listening to Michael Kirk. He's one of the founders and senior producer of Frontline on PBS. For more information about his programs and our programs, please check out our website. And thanks, as usual, for tuning into this edition of Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web